Hey, today we're going to talk about the two numbers that could make or break your long-term profitability, and they're probably not what you think they are.
This is The Rare Advisor, proud to be a part of the Advisor Advancement Network and home of a business model supercharged by recurring and repeatable events. Your host is Mike Walters, CEO of USA Financial. He is an investment advisor representative of and securities are offered through USA Financial Securities, member FINRA SIPC, a registered investment advisor.
Let's talk about the two most important numbers you need to know in order to grow your practice and maintain its longevity. It has to do with assets retained and assets lost, but it's not part of the sales process. It's part of the retention process. And what I mean by that is we're talking about the stats of what happens to your clients as they age with you through and past retirement. Now, Investment News has run a number of different studies over the years. I'm going to be quoting some stats from two articles. One was called Dealing with Widows Requires Empathy and Patience. The other one is called The Great Wealth Transfer is Coming, Putting Advisors at Risk. And one of the things that really jumps out in that study is that, or in those articles, I guess I should say, is that the stat that 80% of women die single, and the exact opposite, 80% of men die married. Now, let's dive into what does that really mean inside of your practice, because the numbers are pretty spooky in terms of the industry standard averages, at least as claimed by Investment News, in terms of the dollars that are lost because people are not properly handling the comprehensive approach to communication within financial planning. Meaning specifically that they're focusing so heavily on the primary breadwinner or the individual who handles the finances in the family, which oftentimes tends to be the man, at least historically. That's obviously probably changing in more modern times. But if they're focused on that individual and the other remaining individual, in this case, let's just say it's the wife, feels like they are not part of the planning process. They feel like the plan is for their husband and that relationship is for their husband. Then what happens is when they outlive their husband, when their husband dies, the vast majority of them fire their financial advisor because they don't believe that plan was built for them, which is probably the exact opposite from the truth, right? Because good financial planning is going to assume that we have to protect the surviving spouse, and the odds are that surviving spouse will be female because they just simply tend to live longer than us males. So we need to make sure in every instance that the wife, that the spouse, that the non-financially oriented individual understands, again, regardless of gender, understands that the plan is built for them specifically as the survivor, more so than the non-survivor. Let's look at some of the numbers. I pulled it all together and ran the numbers on an Excel spreadsheet because that's just what I do. Anyway, I wanted to know how these things shook out. So I said, let's assume we've got $1 million of revenue, annual revenue coming into a practice. And let's assume that 25% of those clients are single. So 25% of the households are single and 75% of the households are married. And again, I'm just taking really basic numbers. So $1 million of revenue, we've got $250,000 accounted for by the single clients, and we've got $750,000 accounted for by the married clients. Now, if that's the case, what's going to happen here when these single clients, they don't have a spouse to pass away at this stage. So these single clients, when they die, one of the other numbers I haven't even touched on yet is that 66% of the children will fire their parents' financial advisor once they've received the inheritance. So they're going to lose 66% of this $250,000, which means they're going to lose $165,000 out of the $250,000 of revenue. That's just for the single individual passing on to the kids. Let's go back and look at what happens to the married people, because that's what gets a little more dynamic and a little more interesting. $750,000 of our $1 million of revenue is credited to these married couples. 70% of married women, now granted, 80% of women die single, but 70% of married women will become widows. That's a stat from Investment News. So $525,000 out of the $750,000 is going to be attached to an individual who becomes a widow as a customer of yours under these averages. And then 70% of widows, so 70% of women will become a widow, and 70% of widows then actually fire their financial advisor after their spouse dies. So that means you're going to lose $367,500 out of that $525,000. But now that still leaves $157,500 that didn't fire their financial advisor after their spouse died. But then eventually they're going to die, and it's going to go to the kids, and 66% of the kids are going to fire the financial advisor once the remaining parent dies. So now you've lost another $103,950. And then if they're non-widowed, then we've got down here where they, if they're non-widowed, they die as a couple. Now we just go straight to the kids. $148,500 gets lost when 66% of the kids fire the financial advisor at that point. So when it's all said and done, what you're finding is 78% of that $1 million, $785,000, is exiting upon death of spouse or upon death of both, because you're not retaining the kids. So you're either not retaining the surviving spouse and or you're not retaining the adult children. 78.5% of the assets of the average financial advisor's practice under these stats, as they were published back in Investment News on those two articles, would be exiting your practice. You would only be retaining 22% of that, or in other words, about $215,000, 21.5% gets retained. And that's simply by not understanding the numbers. So how do you fix that? Well, you fix it by making sure that both of the spouses understand this plan is built for both of them. It's built to protect the surviving spouse in the utmost situation. And then pulling in family meetings and making sure that the adult children understand that this plan was built for them too. It was built to maximize their inheritance and then to sit down with them and maximize the benefits for them and their family and their spouse moving forward. If you can't get that communication through to both of those sets of parties, then you are going to become this statistic as published in Investment News. You're going to lose those assets over time. So this is like the hidden underbelly of a financial practice, the dirty little secret that a lot of people don't understand, because as you're bringing in new clients, it tends to camouflage what's going out the back door. This is what's going out the back door. If we quit bringing money in the front door, suddenly this becomes very, very obvious, because it then becomes a huge drain on your financial practice. And if an astute individual is valuing your practice, the thing that they're going to look at exactly second, like right away, after figuring out what's your recurring revenue and your non-recurring revenue, the next thing they're going to look at is what kind of asset retention do you have upon death of spouse or death of parent. And that creates a huge matzo ball for you to address in the ongoing value of your practice. But the good news is, if you address it, it is highly correctable, and the values and the profitability then go through the roof.
This information is for licensed financial professionals only and is not intended for use in soliciting sales from the public. The views expressed represent the opinions of the presenter or their featured guest, not necessarily those of USA Financial or its affiliated subsidiaries. Industry references are generic and not intended to represent actions or beliefs of any individual or entity. Content is only presented to illustrate general principles, beliefs, or ideas and should not be construed as legal or regulatory advice. Trademark and copyright protected. USA Financial and Affiliates.